The day Howard Jessup drove his tractor into that field, he already knew what they'd say about him. He'd heard it at the feed store. He'd heard it at church. He'd heard it from the John Deere dealer who drove all the way out to his farm just to shake his head and drive back. And still, Howard planted, not wheat, not corn, not soybeans. Not any of the crops that made sense in Kingfisher County, Oklahoma, in the spring of 1976. He planted sorghum, 200 acres of it. Now, before you say anything, before you think, well, maybe sorghum was making a comeback, maybe there was some market shift he knew about. Let me stop you right there. There was nothing like that. Sorghum in 1976 in Oklahoma was not a money crop. It was cattle feed. It was what you planted when you had run out of ideas. It was the crop that told people you didn't know what you were doing. And Howard Jessup? Everyone thought he had absolutely lost his mind. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Let me paint you the picture of Kingfisher County in 1976, because you need to understand what Howard was walking into. Wheat prices were soaring. The export market was booming. Farmers across the county were expanding, borrowing money, buying new equipment, plowing up every acre they had to plant more wheat. Virgil Tate, the John Deere dealer in town, was selling tractors faster than he could get them shipped in. Banks were lending, grain elevators were full. Everything was pointing up. In that environment, planting sorghum wasn't just unusual. It was career suicide. It was telling your entire community, your neighbors, your friends, the men you sat next to at church every Sunday, that you thought they were all wrong. Nobody likes that guy, and Howard became that guy. The morning Virgil. Tate drove out to Howard's farm. He wasn't going to check in on a friend. He was going to see the spectacle. He stood at the edge of that freshly planted field, watched Howard's tractor pulling through the red Oklahoma dirt, and when Howard climbed down to talk to him, Virgil got right to it. Why sorghum, Howard? Wheat prices are through the roof. The whole county's printing money right now, and you're out here planting cattle feed. Howard wiped the dust from his face. He looked out at his field for a moment. Then he looked at Virgil. You want the short answer or the long one? I want any answer that makes sense. Howard smiled. The short answer is my grandfather told me to. Virgil stared at him. Howard, your grandfather's been dead for 30 years. I know, Howard said, and he climbed back on his tractor and drove away. Now here's the part of this story that most people never talk about. Because everyone focuses on what happened in 1980, when the drought came and Howard was proven right. They focus on the triumph, but they skip over the 4 years in between. 4 years. Think about what 4 years of being laughed at actually feels like. It's not just awkward conversations at the feed store. It's your son coming home from school with a black eye because another kid called his father an idiot. It's your wife overhearing 2 women at church saying they feel sorry for her married to a man who can't admit when he's wrong. It's watching your neighbors make real money on wheat while your sorghum barely covers costs, and wondering, in your darkest moments at 3 in the morning, if maybe everyone else is right and you're the fool. Howard Jessup lived inside those 4 years. He didn't just plant sorghum once on a hunch. He planted it 4 springs in a row while the entire county mocked him. They even gave him a nickname, not behind back, to his face. Wrong Crop Howard. That was him. Wrong Crop Howard. Said like a joke, said like a warning to other farmers. Said like a shorthand for what happens when you stop thinking straight. But here's what nobody asking that question understood. Howard wasn't guessing. He wasn't being stubborn. He wasn't some eccentric who liked being different for the sake of it. Howard had read something. And what he'd read had changed everything. It was February of 1976. A winter storm had damaged the roof of the farmhouse, and Howard had to go up into the attic to check for leaks. He'd been farming that land for 15 years since his father passed, and in 15 years he'd never once gone through the old trunk sitting in the corner of that attic. He knew it was there. His mother had mentioned it once. Your grandfather's. Old things, but farming doesn't leave time for nostalgia. There's always something more urgent than looking at the past. That February afternoon, stuck in the attic while the storm blew outside, Howard opened the trunk. Old photographs, a pocket watch that didn't work, a Bible with names and dates written inside the cover. And at the bottom, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, a leather-bound journal. Howard Jessup's grandfather. Elmer had been farming in Kingfisher County since before the First World War. He'd survived the land rush, the boom years of the 20s, and then the thing that nearly destroyed everything, the Dust Bowl. If you've never studied the Dust Bowl, let me tell you what it actually was, because the word drought doesn't capture it. In the 1930s, across Oklahoma and the surrounding states, the combination of years of drought, extreme heat, and decades of poor farming practices caused the topsoil, the actual living layer of earth that made farming possible, to simply blow away. Black blizzards. That's what they called the dust storms that rolled across the plains like walls of darkness. The sky would turn black at noon. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. People choked to death in their own homes. Elmer Jessup's wheat failed in 1931. It failed in 1932. It failed again in 1934 and 1935. 5 years of nothing. 5 years of watching the wind carry his future to Kansas, but Elmer didn't leave. While thousands of Oklahoma families, the Okies that Steinbeck wrote about, packed their cars and headed for California, Elmer stayed. And in 1936, when the drought was at its absolute worst, Elmer did something nobody else was doing. He planted sorghum. It was born of desperation. He'd read about it in a government agricultural pamphlet. Sorghum had deep roots. It could find moisture where wheat couldn't. It was built for punishment in a way that wheat simply wasn't. So Elmer planted 20 acres of it, a small experiment, a last attempt to hold on. That year, while every wheat field in Kingfisher County lay dead and brown, Elmer's sorghum stood green. The yields were low, the price was poor, but it was something. And in 1936, something was everything. Elmer kept growing sorghum through the rest of the Dust Bowl years. He survived when others didn't, and when the rains finally came back and wheat became profitable again, he went back to wheat, like everyone else. But he never forgot what had saved him. In 1945, the year before he died, Elmer Jessup sat down and wrote it all out. Not a memoir, not a family history, a farming guide. Every lesson he'd paid for in sweat and failure and near ruin. Every crop rotation that worked, every water conservation technique, every variety of grain that held up under drought conditions and every one that collapsed. And at the end of it, a warning. Howard read that warning in the attic, in the cold. In February of 1976, the drought will come again. It always does. Maybe not this year, maybe not this decade, but it will come. When it does, remember what I learned. Wheat dies in the dry years. Sorghum survives. Plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. After is too late. 3 hours. Howard sat in that cold attic, reading. When his wife Dorothy finally came looking for him, she found him with tears on his face, holding a book written by a man he'd never really known, Howard. "What is it? What's wrong?" He looked up at her. "My grandfather." He knew what was coming, and he wrote it all down, and we never even looked. That night, Howard Jessup made a decision. Here's the thing I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is bigger than farming. Elmer Jessup had paid the highest possible price for his knowledge. He'd paid with years of failure, with near bankruptcy. With watching his neighbors pack up and disappear forever from land their families had broken their backs to claim. He'd earned that knowledge the brutal way, by living through the worst agricultural disaster in American history. And then, he did something extraordinary. He wrote it all down. He wrapped it in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. He put it at the bottom of a trunk where it would survive. He didn't know who would find it. He didn't know when. He just knew that someone in his family would one day need what he had learned. And so he made sure it would be there. That's not just a grandfather leaving notes. That's a man reaching across decades to protect people he would never meet. And for 30 years, nobody opened the trunk. Now let's talk about what Howard was really choosing in the spring of 1976, because it's easy to look back and say he made the brave call. But in the moment, it wasn't brave. It was terrifying. He had 200 acres and a family depending on them. He had neighbors and friends and a community he'd lived inside his whole life. He had every market signal, every expert opinion, every neighbor's example pointing in the direction of wheat. And against all of that, he had a dead man's handwriting in a leather-bound book. That's what he had. And he chose the dead man. Spring 1976. Howard plants sorghum. The neighbors laugh. Harvest comes. Wheat prices hit over $4 a bushel. His neighbors make money. Howard's sorghum sells for less than $2 a bushel. Barely covers costs. At the feed store, Virgil. Tate doesn't miss the opportunity. Told you so, Howard. Wheat is gold. Sorghum is for fools, Howard smiles. We'll see. Spring 1977. Howard plants sorghum again. More laughter. Another good year for wheat. Another mediocre year for Howard. The late. Jokes have become routine. Wrong crop Howard. Said it like a catchphrase now. Spring 1978. Howard plants sorghum a third time. His son Tommy comes home from school with a black eye because a classmate, the John Deere dealer's kid, called Howard an idiot who was going to lose the farm. Howard doesn't yell. He doesn't defend himself the way you might expect. He does something different. He sits his son down at the kitchen table, opens his grandfather's journal, and for an hour he reads it aloud. He explains the Dust Bowl. He explains what happened to the families who didn't adapt. He explains why Elmer wrote what he wrote. Tommy listens. Then he asks the question that every child asks, and that every parent hopes they can answer honestly. But Dad, what if Grandpa Elmer was wrong? What if the drought doesn't come? Howard is quiet for a moment. His hand rests on the faded pages. Then I'll be the fool everyone says I am. But if he was right, if the drought comes and we're ready, we'll be the only family in this county that survives. He looked at his son. I'd rather be wrong and safe than right and destroyed. Wouldn't you? Spring 1979. Fourth year. Howard plants sorghum again. Nobody is really laughing anymore. It's gone past funny. It's become something sadder. Pity, maybe, for a man who clearly can't change course. And then the weather changed. The winter of 1979 came in dry. Not dramatically dry, just a little short on snow. The kind of winter you don't worry much about. Then the spring rains came late and thin. By May, farmers were watching their fields with uneasy eyes. By June, they were praying. July was the month that answered everything. Day after day of 100-degree heat. Day after day of cloudless sky. That precious, profitable wheat that the entire county had banked on began to wither. First, the leaves curled. Then the stalks went brittle. Then the grain heads, which should have been swelling with crop, stayed shriveled and empty. By the end of July 1980, Kingfisher County was in a crisis that nobody had seen coming. Nobody except a dead man who had written a warning in 1945 and one farmer who had listened. Howard drove through the county one afternoon looking at his neighbor's fields. What he saw stopped him cold. The wheat was brown and flat. In some fields, it had stopped growing entirely. In others, the stalks had fallen over, too weak to stand. The grain elevators that usually roared with activity during harvest were sitting, quiet. He drove home. He walked out to his own fields. His sorghum was stressed. You could see it in the curled leaves, the slowed growth. Sorghum is drought-resistant, not drought-proof. But it was alive. It was standing. And it was going to produce. Dorothy found him at the edge of the field, looking out at those rows of surviving plants. When he turned around, she saw the tears. He was right, Howard said quietly. 40 years ago, he wrote it down. And he was right. When harvest came that fall, the numbers told the story that no one in Kingfisher County could argue with anymore. The county's wheat crop was down 60% from the previous year. 60. Some farms had lost everything. The grain elevator operator, Glenn Mueller, told farmers bringing in 200 bushels where they used to bring 2,000. Some brought nothing at all, and then Howard Jessup pulled up with his sorghum. Glenn walked out and looked at the truck. Looked at Howard. Sorghum, he said. Well, I'll be damned. The feedlots in Texas were desperate. The hay crop had failed too. Sorghum prices had shot up to $3.20 a bushel, and climbing. 6,000 bushels, nearly $20,000, while his neighbors made nothing, from the crop they'd called cattle feed, from the crop they'd laughed at, from the wrong crop. Glenn Mueller started laughing, not the mocking kind, something different, something closer to wonder. "Wrong crop, Howard," he said, shaking his head. "Turns out you were right all along." The news spread through the county faster than the drought had. Howard Jessup, wrong crop. Howard had made $20,000 in the year that everyone else made nothing, had planted the right thing, while everyone planted the wrong thing, had listened to a dead man's journal while everyone listened to the market. Everywhere Howard went after that, people asked him the same question: "How did you know?" And every time, Howard gave the same answer: "My grandfather told me." There's a question nobody thought to ask Howard in the fall of 1980, not the reporters who came to write about the sorghum farmer who beat the drought, not the neighbors who showed up at his door asking for advice, not even Virgil Tate, who finally had the decency to admit he'd been wrong for 4 straight years. Nobody asked, what does a man do with a truth that his community refused to hear? Because Howard hadn't been quiet about the drought coming. Not. Exactly. He'd planted 200 acres of sorghum every year for 4 years in a county where every other farmer planted wheat. That's not subtle. That was a 4-year-long public argument with every single one of his neighbors. And they'd lost that argument. They just hadn't admitted it until the wheat died. So now what? Some men, in Howard's position, would have made that the centerpiece of their identity, would have worn it like a badge, would have become the man who was right when everyone was wrong, would have made sure nobody forgot it. Howard Jessup wasn't that man. But before we get to what Howard did next, we need to talk about 1981. Because if 1980 was bad, 1981 was the year that broke things. The drought didn't end. It deepened. The winter of 1980 brought almost no snow. The spring of 1981 brought almost no rain. By June of 1981, Kingfisher County was in the grip of conditions that hadn't been seen since the 1930s, since the years that Elmer Jessup had written about, the years that his warning had been written to prevent. Some farmers tried to switch to sorghum. You can't blame them. They'd watched Howard make money while they made nothing, and they wanted what he had. But it was exactly what Elmer had predicted would happen to the people who waited. After is too late. They didn't have the seeds. They didn't have the knowledge. They'd never planted sorghum before, so they didn't know how to adjust their equipment for it, didn't understand the different spacing, the different timing, the different soil preparation. Some planted anyway and got poor results. Most just watched their wheat die for the 2nd year in a row. Howard's sorghum survived again. Not as well as the year before. The drought was deeper now, testing even the toughest grains. But 4,000 bushels at prices that had climbed to nearly $4 a bushel. $16,000. 2 years running. By the fall of 1981, the foreclosures started. Dale Watkins, who farmed 400 acres north of town, couldn't make his bank payments. The bank took his land. The Mitchell brothers, who had borrowed heavily to expand in the late 70s, couldn't service their debt. They lost everything, land their family had worked for generations, gone in an afternoon of paperwork. And Virgil Tate's John Deere dealership, things had gone from bad to worse. Half the equipment he'd sold on credit in the boom years was being repossessed. Tractors that had rolled out of his showroom shining and new were coming back. His lot filled, up with machines nobody was buying. His showroom sat empty. Howard watched it happen. His neighbors, his friends, people he'd gone to school with, people he'd helped bring in harvests over the years, losing their land. And he felt a complicated thing. Not satisfaction, not even much vindication, mostly just sorrow. He'd tried to tell them, not with words. He'd known they wouldn't listen to words. He'd told them with 200 acres of sorghum for 4 straight years. And they'd seen it every season and still hadn't learned, because people don't believe in disasters until the disaster is already there. His grandfather had known that too. In the spring of 1982, Howard got in his truck and drove to Virgil Tate's dealership. Virgil had aged a decade in 2 years. The easy confidence of the boom years was completely gone. He looked like a man watching his world fall apart one piece at a time, because that's exactly what he was. Howard. Virgil managed a weak smile when he walked in. Come to gloat? No. Howard sat down across from the dealer's desk. I came to make you an offer. An offer for what? The Watkins place. I heard the bank is looking to sell. Virgil's eyebrows went up. Howard? That's 400 acres. Even at distressed prices, you're talking serious money. Howard reached into his jacket and pulled out a bank statement. He slid it across the desk. Virgil looked at it. His face went pale. $62,000. 3 years of sorghum. 3 years of being called wrong crop Howard. I figure I can offer the bank a fair price, Howard said. More than they'd get at auction, and I can pay cash. There was a long silence. Virgil stared at the bank statement. When he finally looked up, something had shifted in his face. Howard, I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. I called you a fool for 4 years. Wrong crop Howard. I said it to your face. I said it behind your back. I said it to anyone who would listen. Virgil shook his head slowly. And you were right the whole time. Howard was quiet. For a moment, I wasn't right. My grandfather was right. I just listened. Same thing, isn't it? Howard considered that. Maybe that's all wisdom is. Listening to the people who came before. They made the mistakes so we wouldn't have to. We just have to be smart enough to hear them. He stood up and extended his hand. Help me buy that land, Virgil. And then help me find more. The way things are going, there are going to be farms available. I want to pay fair prices. I'm not looking to get rich off my neighbor's pain, but someone should be farming that land. Virgil shook his hand. What are you going to plant? Howard smiled. What do you think? By 1985, Howard Jessup owned 800 acres, the Watkins place, the Mitchell brothers' land, 2 other farms from families who couldn't hold on. He paid fair prices every time, more than the banks were, asking because he understood what it meant to be on the other side of that transaction. He'd watched people lose their land before. He wasn't going to be the kind of man who extracted maximum value from a neighbor's despair. But with 800 acres planted in drought-resistant varieties, diversified now with some careful cattle operation, Howard Jessup had become the largest farm operation in Kingfisher County, and somehow, more importantly, he'd become something he never intended to be: a teacher. Starting in 1982, farmers started showing up at his kitchen table. They came to his fields. They came to his equipment shed to look at how he'd modified his planters for sorghum seed. They came with notebooks and with questions and with the humility of people who had just paid an expensive tuition in the school of hard consequences. Howard taught them everything he knew. He shared his grandfather's journal, made copies of the key pages, explained about drought-resistant crops, about crop rotation, about the cycles of wet years and dry years that had shaped Oklahoma farming for generations. One afternoon, a farmer named Walt Driscoll sat across from him at the kitchen table and asked a question that clearly had been sitting on him for a while. Howard, back in '76 when you first planted sorghum, why didn't you warn us? Why didn't you just tell us what you'd read? Howard looked at him for a long moment. Would you have listened? Walt opened his mouth, closed it, then said quietly, No, probably not. That's why I didn't tell you. I showed you instead. 4 years of showing you. And even then you didn't see, not until the drought made it impossible to look away. He wasn't angry saying it. He was just honest. People don't believe in disasters until they're inside one. My grandfather knew that. That's why he said plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. After is when everyone finally believes, and after is too late. Here's the part of Howard Jessup's story that I think deserves the most attention and gets the least. He didn't have to share any of it. Think about that for a moment. Howard had a piece of knowledge that had made him the only prosperous farmer in his county during the worst agricultural crisis in a generation. He could have kept it private. He could have let the foreclosures continue, bought up the land at rock-bottom prices, and become the wealthiest man in the county by saying nothing. Instead, he opened his grandfather's journal to his kitchen table and started teaching. Why? Because Elmer Jessup had written that journal for exactly this purpose: not to give one man an advantage over his neighbors, to make sure the knowledge survived, to make sure that when the drought came again, and it always comes again, as many people as possible would be ready. Elmer had survived the Dust Bowl by figuring something out. And then he'd written it down not to protect his legacy, but to protect the people who came after him, all of them, the whole county, whether they were Jessup or not. Howard understood that, and he honored it. In 1992, the Kingfisher County Historical Society came to Howard and asked if they could display the journal in their museum. Howard agreed. But first, he sat down and added something, his own chapter. He wrote about finding the journal in the attic in February of 1976. He wrote about the 4 years of planting sorghum while everyone laughed. He wrote about 1980, when the drought came, just like Elmer had said it would. He wrote about the $20,000 and the $62,000 and the 800 acres. And then he wrote a message to whoever would read it next. To whoever reads this next, the drought will come again. It always does. Remember what Elmer Jessup learned in the 1930s. Plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. Learn from the past before you have to learn from your own mistakes. The old ways are not always wrong. Sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work. He signed it, Howard Jessup, November 1992, father and son. 2 entries, 2 generations of the same lesson, separated by 50 years and the same drought. Howard Jessup died in 2001 at the age of 65. He worked his farm until the last month of his life. His funeral was the largest Kingfisher County had ever seen. Farmers came from 3 states, men and women who had learned from him, who had been saved by his teaching, who owed the survival of their farms to a man who had spent 4 years being called Wrong Crop Howard. His son Tommy gave the eulogy. Tommy, the boy who'd come home with a black eye in 1978, who'd sat at that kitchen table and listened to his great-grandfather's journal being read aloud. Tommy held up the journal, the leather-bound book that had traveled from Elmer's hands to a trunk in an attic to Howard's cold hands in February of 1976, to that museum display case, and back to this moment. This journal saved our family, Tommy said. Not once, but twice. In the 1930s when my great-grandfather wrote it, and in the 1980s when my father read it, both times the man in this family who carried that knowledge was called a fool. Both times he was proven right. He looked out at the crowd, at the neighbors, who had called Howard Wrong Crop, at the families who still had their land because Howard had taught them what he knew. My father could have kept this secret. He could have bought land for pennies and said nothing. Instead, he opened his kitchen table to every farmer in this county who would listen, because he believed that helping your neighbor was more important than getting ahead of him. Tommy closed the journal. My father planted the wrong crop for 4 years while everyone laughed. He did it because he trusted his grandfather's words, more than the crowd's opinion. And he was right. The drought came, the sorghum survived, and Howard Jessup became the richest farmer in Kingfisher County, not in money, but in something more valuable. In trust. In respect. In the knowledge that he had done the right thing when doing the wrong thing would have been so much easier. Tommy looked at the coffin, then back at the crowd. Dad always said the same thing when people asked how he knew to plant sorghum. My grandfather told me. Well, now I'm telling you. Listen to the old ones. Learn from their mistakes. And when everyone else is planting wheat, have the courage to plant sorghum. He smiled, his father's smile. Because the drought always comes. And when it does, you'd better be ready. The Jessup farm is still operating today. Tommy's son Michael runs it now, 4th generation on that Oklahoma land. Every spring before planting begins, Michael sits down with his own children and reads them the words Elmer wrote in 1945. The drought will come again. It always does. Plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. After is too late. 4 generations of Jessup, 4 generations of listening, 4 generations of surviving while others failed. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, that journal, sat in a trunk for 30 years. 30 years. 1 generation of Jessup had it and never opened it. Elmer wrote it down so that his knowledge would survive him, and it almost didn't. It almost sat in that attic until the farmhouse was sold and the trunk was thrown away and the lesson was lost forever. It was only a winter storm, a damaged roof, and a bored afternoon that put Howard Jessup in that attic in February of 1976. Think about how close it came to not happening. Think about how many journals like that one is sitting in attics right now, in trunks, wrapped in oilcloth, waiting for someone to open them. Think about how much knowledge gets buried with the people who earned it because we never think to ask them to write it down, or because we never think to look. Elmer Jessup survived the worst disaster in American agricultural history and then did something radical. He wrote down everything he'd learned, not because he thought he was important, not because he wanted to be remembered, but because he understood that the drought would come again and he wanted someone, anyone, to be ready for it. That is what wisdom actually is. Not intelligence, not talent, not even experience by itself. Wisdom is earned knowledge, transferred, and it only works if someone is willing to open the trunk. Howard Jessup opened the trunk. He read the words. And then for 4 years, in the face of ridicule and mockery and the collective certainty of an entire county, he did what his grandfather said, not because it was easy, because it was true. Whatever drought is coming in your life, and something is always coming, the question isn't whether you'll be ready. The question is whether you'll open the trunk.